Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is chapter 56 of Gunnerkrigg Court, New Data.
Hi there.
This chapter is a bit of a break from all the stuff that's been happening with Annie and her dad. In fact, Annie isn't even in this chapter at all. And this is more of an update with Kat and her work with the robots, which is something I like to spend a bit of time examining. And really, I guess the main point of this chapter is I wanted to not only give an update, but also have a go at trying to examine how a creature who has never felt physical sensations would try and describe or experience those sensations. With Robot getting his new arm here, I wanted to make it very clear that it's extremely different from any sort of existing Court hardware. And this is just a little look at the step that Robot, and I guess the other robots, will be taking in the direction of becoming essentially new creatures in the future. And the first thing we see in the chapter is the progress that Kat's made. She's grafted this rudimentary arm onto Robot's existing body. And the two of them talk about how different they are and how Robot won't be accessing it in the same way.
So when writing this kind of pseudoscience, is there anything you keep in mind for what details you share and what ones you don't?
Yeah, the main thing that I keep in mind is that if I try to focus too specifically on any technological explanation, then I'm inevitably just going to get something wrong and come up against the wall that exists between what is actually possible and what is fantasy. And so in this page, for example, Kat is talking about limiters and how Robot might interface with his new body, but she is very vague on the details because, you know, the fact is that this stuff doesn't exist. And I wanted this to be more a look at the theory behind how something like Kat's technology would work rather than the actual specifics of it. And I guess like with a lot of things like this in the story, the specifics are not what is important, just the fact that it is happening and it's Robot's reaction to it and the other character's reaction to it that is what is important, and that's what I like to focus on.
So at this point in the story, how long have Kat and Path been going out?
Well, I try and keep timescales kind of vague, so I guess all I'd say is that they've been going out since chapter 42 when Path asked her out. So that they've been together for a little while now, especially for a teen relationship.
I just noticed that it seems that Path here is pointing out things that you might point out if you know someone pretty well, and it's just nice to see their relationship like that.
Yeah, and kind of like how Kat mentions, she's been spending more time with Path in her workshop than she has been with Annie, especially with all the new stuff that Annie's been dealing with. And I've just been wanting to illustrate that at this point, Annie and Kat might be sort of drifting apart a little bit. But this is only really the beginning of that. And so now that it's ready, Kat sends over the required code that Robot needs to access the changes that she's made, and he has an attempt at explaining the sensation of it, which I decided to illustrate in a 2-page spread. So when I was working on this spread, I spent a lot of time looking at pictures from electron microscopes and really up-close shots of biological specimens, as well as throwing in a bunch of extra stuff that I thought kind of evoked the feeling that I wanted to give. And what I was trying to get at here is a mixture of circuitry starting from the left-hand side, getting further and further away from that as it goes over to the right, and ending in a bunch of eyeballs, because two robot sensors and instruments that record external sensations like touch or temperature they do kind of act like his eyes, and that because that's how he registers sensation. In the same way that he might register heat through a thermal sensor, he registers light through an optical or light sensor. So really what's happening now is he's being inundated and overwhelmed with a bunch of extra new sensations that are really overwhelming him and almost overloading him.
I think that you did a good job of making it grotesque without going beyond the bounds of what you would show in this comic. Was that something you were worried about at all?
Not really. Personally, I don't feel there's anything that you could really see up close in a biological specimen that I would classify as grotesque. I don't feel that there's anything here that you wouldn't see in a microscope slide in a textbook, for example. But it was fun trying to figure out a way of how to kind of convey this feeling without really saying anything. And of course, since we don't see how Robot describes this to Kat and Path, I'll leave that up to the reader's imagination. And the two of them just breeze right past it. And we have a little bit more talk about how Robot's new body works and how it differs from his mechanical body.
Sometimes when we watch sci-fi stories about robots or play games about robots or things like that, we talk a little bit about, you know, what you like and dislike about the way robots are portrayed. When you're doing this sort of thing, which is kind of a story about a robot coming to have human feelings, were you thinking about those tropes you dislike and kind of trying to address those or do your own version of it?
When it comes to the mechanics of Robot's body, I'd say yes. I kind of like examining the exploration of moving from what somebody would consider a mechanical robot towards what would be considered a perfect android, which is to say a mechanical being that would require a doctor to differentiate between that and a living human. So, for example, the difference between the Terminator and Bishop from Aliens. I think there's a world apart in the technology there, and I really like the examination of that type of technology. So what I was doing here, and with the robots in general, I guess I want to make it clear that I'm really only focusing on the mechanics of their body, and I've not really taken a look at the technology involved in their brains and how their minds work, which, if I was being honest, the robots in the comic are a little closer, I think, to goblins or magical creatures, because in essence they are sentient creatures, and they are able to examine their own feelings, and they're self-aware, and they interpret the world as they see it. But I intentionally haven't examined that because I wanted that element of the robots to be a factor that is already settled since the creation of them by Diego, and then also the development that they've put themselves through. And what I tried to show up till now with Kat being able to interpret their programming language is that they really are kind of impenetrable when it comes to trying to understand them from the terms of modern existing technology. And so what Kat is doing here, she's just giving these creatures with extremely sophisticated minds just a new way of interfacing with the world. And that is kind of what will be examined as this chapter goes on. But before we get to the last part, we have the part that is the reason why this chapter is called as it is. And in damaging his finger, Robot comes across a new sensation that he's never experienced before, which is to say, a sensation that he classifies as pain.
I really liked the way that he described it as that he couldn't imagine life before it, because it made me remember when I got my wisdom teeth out and I was in such pain the night after, I couldn't remember what it was like not to be in pain.
Yeah, and I was explicitly thinking of how to describe pain here. I think it's a pretty universal feeling that if you do have an injury on your body, you can't help as a human just to focus entirely on it. And that's really what Robot is experiencing here. And it's through this new understanding that leads him to the conclusion that what Kat is doing here by advancing their bodies is giving him and all of the robots a whole new way of interfacing with the world and experiencing the world around them.
That's really beyond what the robots have ever known before.
It is, yeah. They've been severely limited with just their mechanical bodies. And that's what Robot is explaining to them here, because a few of them do rightly point out, well, why would they want to have a frailer body than they currently do? And Robot explains something that I myself have always found very interesting, is that the limitations of the humans' bodies is what has driven them to create tools and machines and technologies that do things that their own bodies cannot do. Like for here, you have a pneumatically articulated bulldozer that can do a ton more work than even a group of humans could do.
I always like when science fiction doesn't present human frailty as flaws as something that needs to be sort of moved on from, so I liked this storyline a lot.
Well, Robot does touch on something here that Coyote himself has said, which is to say that the most powerful part of a human is their mind. And they're sort of coming close to that with the help of one of Robot's sermons here. And this touches on what I mentioned earlier, which gives the indication that these robots already do express feelings and wants and desires. It's just their bodies have been the limiting factor in that. And Robot is the one who is taking that first step down the path towards really a real understanding of the creatures that have made them and that they share the world with.
Robot isn't really saying anything incorrect or wrong here, but his little speeches always come across as kind of sinister. How much do you try to balance that when you're writing his speeches?
It depends on the scene, but I try to keep them right on the line. Robot isn't saying anything sinister here, but I do understand that having these kind of sermon-esque meetings in secret with the robots might come across as a bit sinister. And that is entirely intentional. And I kind of enjoy catching up with the robot culture in this way, showing that there are things developing away from the main characters and they're growing as a species. And once he's done with his little lecture, he heads off and we get to the other important part of this chapter, which is the ways in which his new body allow him to interact with the people that he cares for. Specifically Shadow here.
I just want to say that I love this little scene. I think it's very sweet.
Yeah, it was kind of fun just having them catch up, and I like switching Robot away from being sort of creepy and sinister to just the very innocent and inexperienced creature that he is.
Did people give you grief for having Robot blushing and sweating there?
No, not at all.
Oh, good, because it's just a visual symbol.
But it was fun just focusing on this one minor part where we can see that Robot is again getting a good understanding in what a new body that is able to experience sensations can mean.
Well, it's nice how you showed that originally Robot felt that pain was the only thing worth thinking about until he found out that that's not the limit of the sensation of touch.
Yeah, that's right. And that is something that, story-wise, we can now leave to Robot to interpret on his own. And as the comic goes on, we see more and more that Kat's work is progressing towards its end goal of making the perfect body for these robots. And at this point in the chapter, we leave Shadow and Robot to go on with their own thing, and we see that Arthur has been watching them the whole time.
And we even saw him earlier in the chapter in the crowd of robots.
And he heads off to just some random building, and a character that we've seen before, this character Juliet, who he seems to be partnered with.
I'll say, no, don't put that in.
And we see that they've been keeping a close eye on Kat's work. And, of course, this will be brought up later on in a future chapter. But I did feel that I had to make a bonus page just specifically mentioning where Juliet and Arthur came from.
But I remember in the comments for that page where Juliet showed up again that people did seem to remember her. I always found her to be a pretty memorable character.
No, they did, and I can usually trust on my readers to understand when I'm calling back to something earlier in the story. I just felt that for Juliet specifically here, I just needed to give a nod back to when she was in the story. And that is that. Come back again for chapter 57 and get it together.
Thanks for listening.